Well, let's get started, folks. Who can tell me the prime character in the first lecture? We're going to have 7 lectures. This is lecture number 5. Next week, we have Reconstruction. And then the following week, we have Goose Creek in the 20th century, which is, I think, is just as fascinating, just as interesting as all this old stuff. But thinking back to kind of get our minds organized a little bit, who was the principal character in the first lecture that we gave? James Moore. Can you tell me something about James Moore? He's a god-awful person, wasn't he? Yep. I think it took god-awful people to settle this frontier. I think if you weren't god-awful, you weren't going to be successful. Then the second time we had a lecture, who was the principal character? George Chicken. And he was a real tough guy because he got beat up at recess all the time because he had the chicken last name. And so by the time he was in 3rd grade, I'm making this up, of course, but he was really tough. A boy named Sue, just like Johnny Cash. Yeah, he was like a boy named Sue. But he came here from England, and he started his business and making money at the 18 Mile House as with his horse as a pack horse trader, and ended up being number 2 in the colony as far as being of authority. And he negotiated very important trade treaties with the American Indians and the Cherokee especially. Okay, the third lecture. Who was your favorite in the third? Blackbeard and Watery Jack. You know, more research needs to be done, and I don't see people rushing around doing research on Blackbeard in Goose Creek and Watery Jack, but I think there's more research to do, and I think that's going to be a story I'm going to have to complete. Do you think, is there any issue, do you think that Blackbeard was indeed born and reared in Goose Creek, South Carolina? I do too. I'm convinced of it. I have no doubts in my mind, but we have to kind of get that advertised. Okay, the fourth one. Who was the hero or the principal personality in the fourth lecture? William Moultrie, that's right. Why was he such a great guy? Not just because of the flag, but he led us into he helped us overcome the British invasion and the revolution. He served in a prisoner of war camp. He was indeed a true patriot. Thank you. I was looking for that word. You hang with me tonight, okay?
And he was buried in 3 places.
Yes. That's right. He's a remarkable guy. And then the next lecture was last week. What did we talk about last week? Huh? No, that was the Goose. That was the week before. Last week was, William Moultrie. That's right. It was William Moultrie. Okay. Well, tonight we're getting into the Revolution, and something else struck me. I mean, the Civil War. Something else struck me. About every 40 years, there's a war in our history. Starting off with the war where they kicked the governor's people out. I mean, brought the governor's people out and kicked the proprietors out of here. And then a few years later, we have the Revolution, and a few years later, we have the Civil War. And before you know it, we're in World War I. So it seems like, why are we always fighting all the time? But damnation to the Yankees, Goose Creek history in your own backyard. Never in my life when I first got here, did I think this place was going to be so rich in history. I just started playing around with it. I was teaching history at the high school, and this little black boy said, "Mr. Heisler," he said, "I know where there's an old church." Did I tell you this? Yeah. And he took me over to the church where he lived, and his brother still gives the tours over there to this day. And that was the St. James Goose Creek Bridge, and church, and that got me started. I was interested in it, and that got me started. I got to know him and his family and his mom, and it's a good adventure for me. So it is in our backyard, and the Revolution, and they tried to invade in 1776, but we said, William Moultrie said, "I'll have none of that," even though he was a Goose Creek boy. He was born and reared where Rivers Avenue is, the Northwoods Mall area, with Trident Tech. That's where he was reared up. And he came up with this flag, and it's a very telling flag. It has the crescent moon, which is the symbol of the second sun, which means you were royalty. You were going to inherit the kingdom. And look, there it is, an artist's rendering of the flag over Fort Moultrie, they call it today, the Palmetto Log Fort. Then we had the gorget. That gorget is not the crescent moon. The gorget is part of the armor that only the royalty could wear. Only men of royalty could wear armor. And they had these neck pieces that went around the throat to protect you. And after the gunpowder was invented and you no longer could use armor as a defense, then they just started wearing it around their neck. And look at this. This is Francis Marion's powder horn. You see where he carved a crescent in there? Why would he do that? He was a French Huguenot. He was not royalty. But it was people, not only were they carving crescent moons into powder horns, they were also ordering porcelain from France and other glassware and different things with the crescent moon, signifying that they were of the upper class. They were royalty. And so I thought that was that's an illegal photograph. That's down at the museum. You're not supposed to take pictures, but I took a picture and ran out. And here I am. Don't tell anybody. Don't let it get out of this room. And here's our first president, George Washington, wearing that gorget around his neck. And that was going to be quite a passé, because when we had we won the Revolutionary War, and we had the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the Declaration of Independence, along with our Constitution, said things like, all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And people are thinking, what do you mean? We don't have royalty? We're all equal? Equal? We've never been equal in the history of England. You had royalty, you had the white folks that weren't royalty, and then you had whatever slaves you could pull together. And people are equal and free. That means I'm going to have to get rid of my slaves? That's not going to work. So this, right from the beginning with the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, it did not resonate very well in the South. And the idea of secession was not all, but 95% about slavery. And we're going to go into some of that, because when you talk to people about why in the world did we have a civil war, they'll start talking about states' rights. It has to do with slavery, 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 slavery. And the whole idea with this treaty that we had in 1783 when we became an independent country was that the sovereignty was every state was an equal sovereign political body. And you could join or you could not join, you could withdraw. And so that's, put a lot of people in a tough position. Decades leading to the Civil War, economic decline. We were no longer part of the British Empire, so we didn't have the protection of the British Navy. We didn't have access to all those tariffs and all that assistance. We had the same markets to sell to, but in no way did we corner the marketplace like the English had for us. And we had slavery, which was very, very beneficial and very advantageous for us here in South Carolina with the rice culture. And the differences in Congress led to war because we recognized ourselves as an independent state, and we didn't want the federal government to be messing with our rights to own slaves. And here it is here. They said, because you don't have the right to come and tell us we can't have slaves, but we're angry with you because you will not force those other states to return our slaves. So they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. You want me to say that again? You can't come and tell me I got to get rid of my slaves, but you better go and tell Ohio to send back the slaves that have run away. So they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. And I'm not a South Carolinian, but I am. I think maybe I'm just about more of a South Carolina. I love South Carolina. I love Goose Creek. And so when I say something that isn't real kind about my state or my place, it's because it's the truth as far as I can tell. The future was uncertain. And I just mentioned why it was uncertain, especially with the forced servitude that the South was depending on. If you say people are created equal and have all these rights, and I have to get rid of my slaves, how in the world am I going to support my family? My plantation is going to collapse. Now, after 1783, we're an independent country. We exported these things into the world market: rice, hides, naval stores, corn, lumber products. Other than the absence of indigo, the list was unchanged by the Revolution. I think maybe I mentioned last week, we made the worst indigo in the world. It was just bad stuff. I don't know why it was bad, but if it wasn't for England, nobody would buy our indigo. It's just that if you didn't buy South Carolina indigo and get the special trade benefits of being in the English Empire, then nobody would buy the stuff from you. And England bought all their indigo from us. Give us an opportunity. But it wasn't any good. And as soon as we had the Revolutionary War, nobody would buy our indigo, and we were up the creek. There it is. They would put it in these little packets, and then we'd stack it in the barn and let a little mildew type of thing grow on it, and they would clump it up and put it into chests and barrels and send it abroad. The markets were the same as we had with England, but we didn't have the tariffs, we didn't have the special deals that England had. So we were still dealing with Rotterdam and the French West Indies and Madeira and Havana and all the U.S. ports, but we didn't have the special deals that the centuries of the English ruling the seas, ruling the Atlantic had woven together. Now, three Goose Creekers, Gideon DuPont, he lived at Otranto. John Poyas, he lived at Yeaman's Hall. And Thomas Middleton lived at the Oaks. These were three of the five signers of the state currency when we became the state of South Carolina. So by golly, 3 of the 5 for the state, that makes me feel like Goose Creek was pretty doggone important. The St. James Goose Creek Parish. Only the diversified plantations continued to break even. Brick baking helped. I love the day books that these guys would keep, or the diaries, or the letters they would write. This guy kept a day book that day Peter Stoney at Medway wrote, 2 hands digging clay, 1 hand carting clay to pit, 1 hand filling pit, 6 hands cutting wood, hauling wood, molding bricks, 1 hand putting out fire, 1 hand loading bricks under shed. They were making more and more and more of these bricks. It's a long, complicated, hard process. But Medway was especially, I mentioned Peter Stoney at Medway. Medway was especially, had good clay, and they were right on the back river, so, and was able to get to deep water very quickly. And by being able to make bricks and sell bricks mostly to Charleston, like Fort Sumter was made out of Medway brick. They sold the bricks to Charleston. They were able to diversify what they were producing, and they were able to stay in business because they couldn't just rely on the typical, on indigo or rice. Gideon DuPont owned Otranto in 1783, and he introduced the tidal culture method of rice production. You can see the marks on those trees there. You see where the water would come up and then go down and then come up, and you can see there's a second level up on that tree, and then would go down when the tide goes down. This is fresh water, but it's being pushed up and it's being lowered by the salt water farther downstream. It all makes sense to you. And this is called, the tide going up and down is called the pitch of tide. Here in Goose Creek, you have about 1.5 foot pitch of tide. But in the Cooper River, you had as much as 6 feet difference between high tide and low tide. Now, Gideon DuPont, who owned Otranto, he thought that he had invented the method of using the pitch of tide to fill the ponds, close the gate, water the rice, kill the weeds, when the water was low, open up the gates, let the water flow out of the rice pond, and then let the rice grow for a while. Doing that back and forth worked really well at Otranto, but it was nowhere compatible to what you could do on the Cooper River with the pitch of tide being 6 feet. And if you could capture, and in this case, as you can still see 50 to 100 acres of embanked land along the Cooper River, and not only can you use that embanked water by opening the gate and letting it flood in and out of your rice fields, but you could let it flow through this building and let it turn a wheel and grind the rice and clear the husks off the rice. You could also use that water power to turn the wheels to cut wood. Was there a question down there? Okay. Any questions on that? Because do you know where the Cooper T is?
East Branch, yeah.
The east branch of the Cooper T. But when you get to the T, you can see it. And another reference would be it's almost within sight of Charlesbury. Almost within sight of Charlesbury. Johnny, how could you explain that better?
If you put your boat in at Factor's Gardens and go up Round Creek, you take a right, that's actually the East Branch. And that's Farm Creek, that whole area is called Farm Creek. As soon as you take that right, that building is just around, I think, 2 bends, right before the T's.
And I have some great pictures. Maybe I can get some of those and bring them next week. I just had these two for tonight. That shows the mechanisms and the whole bit. But an Otranto plantation house, I was talking about Gideon DuPont. He asked the state of South Carolina to give him a loan patent on the method of using hydro levels to grow rice. But there was two others that had submitted a request to the patent office for the brand new state of South Carolina, and so they would not grant a patent to anybody. So the idea of using that rice, the hydro methodology of raising and lowering your water was used freely throughout South Carolina. And so in case I forget, rice became such an important crop in South Carolina, especially on the Cooper and the Santee River, that it was sold around the world. Carolina gold rice had a reputation of being the finest rice in the world. Now I'm jumping ahead 100 years, but in 1900, the last emperor of China's last meal was Carolina gold rice. Isn't that interesting? He's getting rice shipped all the way across the world because that's his favorite. And you know, as the emperor, he could have whatever he wanted to eat. Now the capital went elsewhere because you used to grow a little bit of rice in your Goose Creek plantation, and you'd have some waterways like Hal Hall. When you go over to Hal Hall, you can't even find where the water is. There's a Foster Creek gave you some water, and that was about it. But the capital was being invested at other places, no longer in Thorogood Plantation, a Hal Hall Plantation, nor Otranto, Bowens, or White House Plantation. It went to the Cooper and the Santee Rivers. So that the economy in Goose Creek got worse. Even though the rice culture increased greatly, the economy in generally got worse. Timothy Ford, a Goose Creek landowner, wrote in his diary in 1784, "The number of slaves supplies almost a total want of instruments of husbandry, and the dint of muscular force, the want of invention." Now, I don't go around looking for this stuff about Goose Creek. I just go around and read as much as I can, and the stuff comes out, slaps me in the face, and I write it down. I thought this was pretty interesting. And Edmund Ruffin, the Southern agricultural reformer, described Goose Creek in the 19th century. He said, "Goose Creek, as much a scene of desolation as any." So a few in the Cooper River and the Santee River, they were making fortunes on this rice using hydroculture. But the old plantations in Goose Creek could no longer compete. In one address by Frederick Porcher, he recalled that after the Revolutionary War, highway robbery and horse stealing were so common that, quote, "persons rarely ventured to travel the Goose Creek Road without arms." So it's getting vicious, it's getting dangerous.
Right now, isn't it? Yeah, I was gonna say.
She said it's almost like that now. So, I'm the clown in this room. That is true. You know, I am more cautious now than I've ever been. When I was a kid, I was too stupid to be cautious. Now I'm kind of thinking, looking up and down, making sure that everything's safe. That just comes with being mature, I think. Here's the Goose Creek Road there by Trident College, Junior College, and Northwoods Mall. You see all the way to the right is the Goose Creek Bridge. It's not far from there. And the reason I'm showing you this is those large plantations were turning into small, large farms, but they were no longer plantations. They were just being subdivided. Places like the French Botanical Garden, that's down where the airport is. And then we had artists that were trying to capture some of the beauty of the falling plantation era. This is my favorite, Gabriel Manigault. This is Steep Brook, that water that flows across the parking lot at Northwoods Mall. It flows to Goose Creek, down into Goose Creek, and that house is overlooking Goose Creek right there. It was owned by Gabriel Manigault. He was the richest man in North America. The second richest man was from Maryland, and he had 1/3 of the wealth as this guy did. So this was high cotton as far as Manigault. There's another Charles Fraser. That's the St. James Goose Creek Church, from a different angle there, isn't it? Coming in from the south. Few estates remained successful. And the movement started shifting away from the wealthy, educated royalty of the big plantations on the eastern end of the parish. It started shifting out to the mid-parish and farther out towards the west. The great agricultural plantations in the eastern section and the emergence of less affluent farms in the central and western parts. Leadership also shifted there. John O. Wilson of Wassamasaw became a political leader, and he built this house after the American Revolution. It's the 30-mile marker made by his grandfather, John O. Wilson. This house is still there. You can see it if you go out to Wassamasaw and you know where to look. And this is Wassamasaw. How many know where Wassamasaw is? It was probably the most significant geographical feature in the St. James Goose Creek area that directed the development of this part of South Carolina, because you can get through there if you want to walk half a day chest high in water. You can get through there, but it's kind of tough to get your pack horse to go through there. And so that's why everybody left Charleston. They went to the 18-mile house. They went to Monk's Corner, then they went to the Santee River and followed the Santee River up all the way around Columbia, and then from there they went to the mountains. If it wasn't for the Wassamasaw, if you could go this way, they could have gone straight out instead of having to go north and then follow the Santee River. So it's very significant. Naval stores continued. Exportation slowly increased. Most Goose Creekers struggled until the Civil War, when the emancipation of slaves caused total economic collapse. High society that long characterized the eastern third of the parish was replaced by absentee landowners, less affluent planters, tenants, and slaves. This is another movement that's fascinating to me, because these rich royal guys and families, they were too uppity to stay out here all the time and run the plantation, so they just started staying down in Charleston, and they'd have their slaves. In one case, like Bowen's Corner in Hanahan, became an independent slave community, because the freed slave was in charge of running the place, but he married one of the enslaved women, and so their children were what? They were kind of free and kind of not. Anyway, this place became independent. We don't have time to go into the details, but Bowen's Corner is a good example during this period what happened to the people that were running the plantations. The owners were down in Charleston, and the slaves, and some white people just had slaves they brought around with them, and they would put them to work. Like this guy here, overseers became common. Among 154 heads of households in Goose Creek in 1810, there were 36 new families not present 20 years earlier. So you see the land is breaking up and new families are moving out. Most of these additional heads of households were overseers who settled on the old estates in the eastern section. These guys, here's there's 4 guys that owned slaves, and they'd go around and rent the slaves to the plantation owners. One guy had 137 slaves, one 129, another guy 69 slaves, and one guy had 6 slaves. If you read the Green Book, if you read the Green Book, the big fat Green Book, it goes into all the details on who had slaves and how much they got for them, that sort of thing. As a consequence of predictable summer fevers, more planters spent the warmer months in well-drained pine forest communities such as Somerville and Panopolis, or near the ocean breezes of Charleston and the Sea Islands, and returned to the countryside after the first frost. That is the reason the people were catching malaria. Malaria are 2 Latin words pushed together there that means bad air. Well, there wasn't anything wrong with the air. It's just that you don't have mosquitoes. If you don't have, if the land isn't wet, if you don't have puddles of stagnant water, you're not going to have mosquitoes. So one thing they do not have in Somerville, I'm looking at my friend from Somerville, is you don't have water out there. And so you don't have mosquitoes out there. And the Somervillians, they thought for many years, well, you come to Somerville, it's very healthy because it smells wonderful. You have these pine trees. Why do you have pine trees in Somerville? Because pine trees have that long root that goes down through the sand, and they can survive there where other trees can't. So when you have sand, no water on the surface, deep-rooted trees like pine trees, it smells really great, but it has nothing to do with being healthy. It's healthy because the mosquitoes aren't there. Same thing with Pineville, the same thing with all the way from Somerville all the way to Whitesville. From Somerville to Whitesville was the places where people would live. And also places like Panopolis and, what's the other place right up here? Panopolis and, never mind. Huh? Pimlico, yes, that's what I was trying to think of, thank you. Summertime at the beach. These guys went to the beach in the summer, and they let their lead slave man take care of the plantation. I'm sorry, Thomas Middleton, he had white overseers. Thomas Middleton of the Oaks. He died at the beach and was brought back to the St. James Goose Creek Church for his internment. 60% of the landowners did not employ white overseers. They were so-called free-colored overseers during the 19th century. By 1830, this is just 30 years before the Civil War, there were 61 emancipated African-American Goose Creekers, some of which were employed as farm workers and overseers with varying levels of responsibilities. Many used African-American overseers. During this period, 40% of the landowners in the eastern section used white overseers, 27 planters. 60% did not employ white managers, which meant they used the managers that lived on the land, the black ones. And I'm just going to let you look at these. If you're interested, if there's some names here that strike a fancy and you want to find out more about it, go to the library and get the books on Goose Creek. Just say, I want the Goose Creek books, and they'll show you the section that has them. And the green book, I analyze all these families and all these people, and who the landowners were and where the land was located. And these are the planters that didn't have white overseers. They used black overseers. Planters without white overseers used black overseers. The second one there, Michael Keckley, that's Spring Grove Plantation, right up there by Cypress Garden and go on the road to Cypress Gardens. Anybody see anything that interests you? Benjamin Paul Williams, he's at 22. That's Strawberry today. People that live there call it 22. It's 22 miles from Charleston. Non-agricultural jobs were few and unstable. So let's see, where the 18 Mile House Tavern, that was Lewis Breaker. That's interesting. What are some of the other taverns? How about the 23 Mile Tavern? I don't see it on there. I must not have been able to find it. There's a carpenter, Alexander Bunn. I just went through the census reports, you know, that you got them every 10 years now, and they have the enumeration census, which tells you the person's name, how many kids they had, you know, who lived in the sandwich, what their address or location was, and they have the agricultural census, which is another whole set of records, shows you what how many chickens they had, how many hogs they had, what they produced, and then they had the social census, where the churches were, how many people attended the churches, and the institutional census. So for every 10 years, you get a lot of information that's available. I don't think they do that anymore, but they did that back then for about 80 years. Yes, sir?
They had a Mary Brown back then, huh?
A Mary Bell?
Mary Brown.
Where is she there? Oh, yeah, tavern keeper. Tell me about Mary Brown.
Well, one of Mary Brown's somebody in the office up here in Berkeley County.
Oh, yeah, Mary Brown, yes. That probably her ancestor.
Yeah.
I'll have to, yeah, tell Mary that her ancestor's on there. Yeah, I know Mary. And I think we just got a couple more pages, but it's just flushed with lots and lots and lots of information. William Tate's another carpenter. James Reardon, cabin, there he is, tavern keeper, 23 Mile House. That's 1 block, 1 mile from the St. James Goose Creek Chapel in the Strawberry area. And it's right there where the volunteer fire department is on Old Highway 52. That's where the tavern was, and that's where he was. Tavern keeper at 23 Monk's Corner Road. James Reardon, yeah. The Deese brothers relied on overseers. They had a boat called Joseph, and which was the name of his, did I say that up there, one of his slaves? Yeah, the schooner Thoroughgood was sold along with its slaves sailor named Joseph. And the Deese brothers bought slaves in Africa and brought them back here. They were in the slave business, and they advertised for the sale of slaves when they got them here. Now, when they went out to go get the slaves in Africa, when they bought those slaves, they were already slaves. They were not bought by the Deese brothers and made slaves. They were bought as slaves, brought over here and sold as slaves. And that gets confused sometimes when you watch movies like Kunta Kinte with the white sailor running through the woods and catching Kunta. That ain't happening. No white guy is going to sit on a boat for 30 days and then get out and capture young, healthy African Americans. So that's one of those misnomers. But the Middleton's Oaks Plantation, for 116 years, the Oaks Plantation was in the Middleton family. Thomas Middleton died, but he conveyed it to the Garners that ended the multi-generational ownership of the famous Oaks. He sold it to Adam Tunno, a Charleston merchant. And then they make fun of Isis Moses, who was a Jew. They said, now we got some Jew guy. The things they said and wrote about this guy was really pretty bad. Now, he wasn't a very good landowner, and he kind of was questionable on some of the things he did, but they made fun of him and said he's going to cut down all the trees and sell them to the shipyards because he don't care about the beautiful trees in the oaks. One chronicler wrote, "We stopped a few moments to gaze down the avenue of live oaks belonging to Mr. Moses, a son of Abraham, who is of his true style of his nation, offered it to the ship carpenters." The trees are still there, yeah. The ship carpenters, he wanted too much money for the ship carpenters would not buy them. Oh, see those little girls there? That's one of my favorite pictures. And I wish it was a little better. You can see the expressions in their face. And I feel very sad that fence is gone and those gates are gone now. Carlton Vose bought the Oaks, and he also had the 18-Mile House Tavern. And he used it not to produce great amounts of crops because rice was no longer profitable. The old rice fields were fallen. But he raised cattle and corn, but no cotton or rice. So here it is very quickly. Absentee land ownership shifted stewardship away from the owner. The overseers were transient. Some African American slaves became entrenched on the land. Some African American slaves were as transient as their overseer owners. Matriarchal systems emerged, that is, the woman of the African house became the leader of the house because many of the men, African men, were sold away from the family, and some semi-independent slave communities established. Some employed free-colored, such as Benjamin Paul Williams, John Bowen, and James Withers, owned homes in Charleston where they spent the unhealthy warmer months of the year, and they had the so-called free colors stayed around the year, all seasons, on the plantation. Mary Katie Brown, I'm such a nerdy guy. When I see an old cemetery somewhere, I go and I read all the inscriptions on there. You do that too? Well, look what I found. This is over near the Wassamasaw Baptist Church, but it's not the Wassamasaw Baptist Church cemetery. It's, I think they call it Long Ridge. There's a little housing area near it. That's where this is, and look what's on one. Mary Katie Brown died 1899, lived over 80 years. Mom, you know what mom means? The black lady in charge of the household. If you got any cooking to do, any cleaning to do, any spanking of the kids or disciplining, she did it. She was like the mama of the house. And they have a stone there for her. These stones were all imported. Nobody had any stones here in South Carolina. They're not natural here. You had to bring them in. You had to ship them in. They're very, very expensive. And she had a stone. She was a highly respected woman that ran that plantation. I wish I knew more about her. I haven't been able to find a thing about her other than just what's on there. Here's interesting. This guy, John Carmyle, fell in love with Henrietta, his slave woman. This can be real complicated. He took it to the South Carolina Supreme Court where the wife and the family, the children finally got their freedom, but for years he struggled within the law of South Carolina to get the right to marry the slave that he was in love with. And finally, the Supreme Court of South Carolina allowed it. They freed, instead of allowing him to marry a slave, they allowed him to free them and then could marry him. Understandably, some white and black Goose Creekers were sorely challenged to adhere to the strict racial codes, but in spite of love or money, the state leadership was determined to safeguard the old social order. So it took years before they would allow a white guy to marry a black woman. Here's Lamb Stevens. You go ahead and read that. This is my favorite character. I'm going to sit down and let y'all read it. Oh, you guys are great. You do this with a bunch of school kids, they'd be over there fighting and doing all kinds of stuff. You know, you guys are actually reading everything. That's great. Yes.
The cemetery is off of Corporate Parkway, going towards CVS at Crowfield. Is that part of Lamb Stevens plantation or not?
Okay. I don't know. I don't understand what you're telling me, but I can tell you what. You know where Cherry Hill is?
You know where Cherry Hill is?
Forget it. It's not there. Okay. The West Vaco development came to me and asked me to look at I gave them my book, and they went through there and just picked out names and named the subdivision Cherry Hill. Cherry Hill is where the Exchange Park is.
Right.
Okay. And that's where he lived.
The cemetery that's right there, as you come out of Crowfield on Corporate Parkway, off to the right, going towards CVS. Are you familiar with that cemetery?
I'm not following you, but the cemetery where he's buried is at the Exchange Park.
You're right, Cherry Hill.
Then that's it, the Cherry Hill Exchange Park. Yes, ma'am.
All the way to the flea market.
Yes, that's right. That's what I meant to say. You're exactly right. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You kept saying the Parkway, and I'm not sure what the Parkway is, but... Huh?
Corporate Parkway Road, like you go in by CVS,
Just before you get to College Park Road.
on the right.
Okay. But we know where the big flea market is, right? Exchange Park? Are we talking about different things? Okay, we're talking about different things. I have in my head Cherry Hill, where he's buried at the big Exchange Park. You're telling me there's another cemetery. Give me one more chance. Where is it again? Corporate Parkway. Now I'm at Crowfield Boulevard, and I'm going to Quazell.
One light before you get to Stratford High School.
By the fire station.
You turn right, and that's the corporate, goes out by Quazell Lighting, and it comes out at a light by CVS.
Let me think about it, ma'am. I'm sorry. You know, getting older is tough. I can't follow you, and I'm so sorry. You did a good job. A Corporate Parkway, I cannot get that into my head.
Right, you know where the Walgreens is?
No, I don't know where a Walgreens is. Why would I know that?
The one on Crowfield Boulevard, there's a Walgreens, right? And there's a fire.
Yes, I know where that is,
And
yes.
the fire station.
Yes.
Well, it's in between there. They're where the traffic light is.
Yes.
One side is the Hamlets and the other side is the Corporate Parkway. And it goes back where they have some businesses. And there's a doctor's office and all back in there. You know where it is.
Well, the Corporate Parkway got me going. I'm going to move ahead. But, and, what?
I have a question about the,
Yes, sir.
when I read this, do I read that Lamb Stevens was a black man?
Yes.
He owns his own place. Is that common?
No, it was not. This is a very unusual. That's why he's right out here in front of us, because I thought, oh my gosh. And more research needs to be done with him too. And also another guy by the name of Cuffy Campbell. I'll talk about him if I have time. But he's the only black man that I ever came across that fit into these sort of characteristics. He was born into slavery in North Carolina. There was some sort of something going on between him and the wife of the owner. I'm not saying it's bad, but there was something going on there. He ended up in Dorchester County as a freedman. Okay? So from North Carolina to Dorchester County, he becomes a freedman. And then he buys property at the Cherry Hill site. And he combines it with his neighbor where the golf course clubhouse is, the Hamlets.
Yeah.
He bought all that also. So he had a very large plantation with 17 slaves in 1860, but he had more slaves earlier. And he's a fascinating guy, and I need to do more work on him, or any of you can do more work, because he would do things such as mortgage his grandchildren, loan them out and sell them, and then buy them back when he needed capital to purchase. His neighbors were in awe of him. Matter of fact, the neighbors said that he was exceedingly black, which meant he was a very, very, very black guy. And they said he's exceedingly black. But they said that because they don't have any idea how in the world he could be so successful and so brilliant and have such wonderful crops and good management and get so much land accumulated and be a black guy. They were just in awe of him. And anyway, there's a lot of pretty cool stories. I need to write a book on Blackbeard, Watery Jack, and this guy. they're all in the same, oh my goodness, categories. Any other questions on him? And I'm sorry I wasn't able to really. There's another cemetery over there. Right? Thank you so much. I bet you I've been there. And here's Lamb Stevens' gravestone. You see he died at the age of 102. He married a young girl. She was only about 78 when he died. Well, hey, he was 102. What a guy. And see the willow tree there? And that was one of my best days, was finding his stone. I didn't know by any chance that there'd be a stone anywhere that had him there. And cotton greatly altered the southern economy, but it did not help Goose Creek. It didn't help South Carolina, especially did not help Goose Creek. So the slaves weren't working around here, and they were being shipped out west to Texas and other Louisiana and Alabama and those places. But it was not used in Goose Creek because the land was worn out, and the Goose Creek slaves were generally just hired out to work on public projects such as canals and roads. This was a typical African American family. I don't know where that family is. I don't know where that photograph was taken. Yes, Walter?
Back in the day, given the way things were, how did black folks acquire the wealth to buy property?
I don't know. That's why it's a mystery how Lamb Stevens could go from North Carolina to Dorchester, be free, and purchase property. There's something was going on behind the scenes that I've never learned about. And there's more to them. I can sit down and maybe you and I have a cup of coffee one morning at Alex's and talk about it. Okay. But I thought that was a typical family that, all ages there. The senior grandfather there in the middle, and the mom and dad and the kids, and that is what South Carolina just ripped. Whatever culture was left in South Carolina was ripped away by cotton, because they shipped the black men to the cotton plantations out in the west. Thomas Jefferson spoke very enthusiastically about the demise of cotton, demise of slavery in South Carolina. And in the South, he said, it's going to die out. But the cotton gin made cotton very, very profitable. And so slavery just really entrenched itself in the South, but not in South Carolina. Cotton failed in Goose Creek because the land wasn't fertile enough. And they had a whole lot of places called old fields where you couldn't grow a thing except weeds. Old field schools, that's where they would build the schools when they would build these schools. And we're going to have a chance when we do the 20th century lecture to look at the curriculum and look at these school buildings and look at what they actually taught. But when they built these schools, they would build them on ground that couldn't be used for anything else. And then we had the Santee Canal that used a lot of labor. And they hired out a lot of people. Santee Canal Park, you can visit that. How many of y'all have never been to the Santee Canal Park?
I just was.
Okay. Well, boy, y'all doing great. That's a wonderful place to spend some time with your family. And there's remnants of the canal. And that's just a model of it, what the canal looked like. The reason they had to dig the canal was if you could try to get from down the coast from the Santee River was deep enough to float boats. You could put things on it and float things to market. But you had to go from the Santee River outlet in the Atlantic Ocean down to Charleston. And there was, because of storms and other problems, if you could do it and stay inland, it would be much better. That's why they had this canal, so you could stay inland and go from the upper waters of the Santee and go right straight into the Cooper River. And then the Cooper River brought you right down to Charleston Harbor. Whoops.
Yeah, I learned to jump real high there.
Tell me again?
I learned to jump real high there because of the
At the canal? Because of the alligators?
Yeah.
Wow. One of the many landowners who hired out their slaves for road and bridge work assigned 5 of her bound workers as, quote, hands liable to work the high roads. I'm going to try to get through this. We've been here about 45 minutes, and we got a lot more to do. One of the most important projects from my rendering was when they put in the road from the Goose Creek Bridge, that's near where the St. James Goose Creek Church is. They put that road all the way to Columbia, and they went across Wassamasaw Swamp. So now you had a way to easily and marketably be able to go back and forth across the Wassamasaw Swamp. But I thought that this was worth reading the whole thing. One guy, a Yankee, was down here visiting, and he wrote this in his letters. After traveling a few miles, we entered on the state road to Columbia and over the Goose Creek Bridge. Other materials failing, they have split small logs in half and have laid them bridge fashion, the flat side upward, and covered them with a few inches of clayey sand. As the chairs or rigs in this country have no springs, this kind of road keeps your bodies in a perpetual quiver, and you are left to apprehend that your brains may be shaken out of place or addled. Then he went on and wrote more. Yet it must be acknowledged that the road is much improved, especially for wagoners, from its former state when the wheels used to sink deep into the sand. Such is the state turnpike, and the toll is duly collected at the proper distances so that you have the pleasure of being well shaken and paying for it, half of which pleasure you enjoy on a northern turnpike. He's a wise guy. Now, the Goose Creek Bridge, I'm just going to kind of summarize this too. This is not a photograph of the Goose Creek Bridge. I've never found a painting, a sketching. I've never found anything of a rendering of the Goose Creek Bridge, but I have a very detailed definition, a very detailed description on how it was built in the records of the South Carolina state government. They have very detailed records, and I have testimony from people that lived nearby at the time, like John Poppenheim said that the bridge had exceptionally fine cypress shingles. So just one little sentence like that means it had a roof on it. And this is what I think it looked like. But that is not a picture of the Goose Creek Bridge. I've never been able to find one. And it was there for about 100 years.
Any idea how long it was?
Yes, I do, but I don't remember. But I'll look it up. I have the description on how many, the bricks, they had bricks on both ends. And 200 feet, does that make sense? What? Oh, there it is. I'm over here I said 200 feet. I'm sure glad I got it right. It's right there. Well, quit asking me questions like that. It's right there. Better roads to the hinterlands, along with deteriorating health and soil conditions in the eastern section, resulted in the central and western sections of the St. James Goose Creek Parish becoming retreats of opportunities for yeoman farmers. South Carolina granted land in these sections to 101 farmers from 1792 to 1860. The awards for land in the mid and upper parish often consisted of about 500 acres, though many were larger and some even consisted of 1,000 acres or more, resulting in a mean size of 744 acres. Remember when we did the lecture on the ghosts, and we did Somerville Lights? We talked about how the state of South Carolina confiscated all this farmlands because they owed back taxes. They took advantage of that, and then they sold the land to Prettyman, who was a Somerville businessman that ran the train tracks out there and harvested and then put in oil derricks. Well, this was the beginning of all those farms. Thomas Hilton, anybody ever hear of that? Thomas Hilton is the farthest reach of the St. James Goose Creek Parish. He was one of the first to come in the early 1800s. I think in 1814 he built that house and settled there. Thomas Hilton. The first mayor of Goose Creek was Hilton Waring Bunch was his name. So there's a relationship between the first mayor and this guy. And Baxter's house is just something I lifted off a plat from near Wassamasaw. The Varner Clark house at Varnertown. Those little brown kids, they're Indians. They're Native Americans. And we don't have a time tonight to go into all the details. Goose Creek is such a fascinating place. Early on, none of the planters wanted to have any of the land out there around Carnes Crossroads because there's no water. And you can't have a plantation if there's no water, because you might have a real great place for about 10 years and then you'll have a drought and everything's going to die. It's not worth it. So they left it for the Indians. The Etowah Indians were the only Indians in the state that allied themselves with the Caucasians. So they said, well, you guys can wander back and forth from Somerville to Monk's Corner, back and forth. You just wander back and forth. You don't plant stuff, you just live off the land. Well, after the Yamasee War, They gave all the captured Indians, men, women, and children, to that tribe to be their slaves. But they sold the men down to Barbados, and they kept the women and the children, and so the culture just sort of faded away. But they were brown, okay? And if you're brown, you could live there. White people lived over there, black people lived over there, brown people lived in Wassamasaw. I mean, not Wassamasaw, Carnes Crossroads. And that's where the first, I'm just yapping now, that's where the first Filipino went, because he was brown, Jose Bugayzon, and he married a brown woman from Carnes Crossroads, and that was, I hope I have her picture. I don't have her picture, they just have her 3 children there. And the little boy on the ladder, you see him? He got killed in a bar fight. He married a white girl and took her out drinking in North Charleston and got into a fight because he had a white wife, and they killed him there. It's hard for us to understand the built-in emotional hatred centered around race back then.
There's still Varners in Varner County.
Oh yeah, the Varners are still there, Sheriff, and I just sent a notice out to the Bugayzon. There's a lady, whose last name, I saw it on Facebook yesterday or today, her last name is Bugayzon, and that's the same as the Filipino that was the first settler out there. I was trying to get her to answer me back and find out a little bit about the family.
You can go out there and buy a collard for the holidays.
Yeah?
Yeah, they have a sign right there beside 17A. You can go out there.
At Varnertown?
Yeah, Dwayne Boss is there, I think. No, that ain't funny, I don't guess it.
Okay.
That's where the qualifying thing is for the Charleston City policemen. They go out there and turn out there and go out there and shoot and all that.
Well, I got a whole program on Carnes Crossroads, an entire lecture, a whole hour-long thing explaining that place. Is fascinating. Got to keep moving. Spring Hill Methodist Church, there's a water site behind it, and I just showed you the picture of the first minister there. Wassamasaw Baptist Church, the big plantations were breaking down, and so the communities of small farms and farmers and small families, they began to just center around churches. Bethlehem Baptist Church in Groomsville, Reverend Stephen Williams' house, and that's the way it looked back then, that's the way it looks now.
Yeah, they're remodeling it.
Yeah.
Too.
Isn't that pretty? And then here's some more information. Just look at it for a second. If you're interested, you have to get to the book and discern it. But we had only 4 people had over 100 slaves in 1830. In 1860, 5 people had over 100 slaves. The farm sizes was 650 acres, valued at $2,400. And then we started having protest meetings leading to Civil War. In 1828, there was an anti-tariff meeting at Wassamasaw Chapel. And those are the guys that served on the anti-tariff meeting. In 1832, that's just, 4 years later, nullification was the central issue. Union candidates are there, John Davis and Representative Stohicker. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the political power and the political leadership was shifting from the eastern parish plantations in the eastern part of the parish to the central and western part. The leadership for this parish are emerging out of these meetings. And one meeting they had at Cypress Campground, they concluded, they drafted a resolution against the northern fanatics. And a committee of vigilance was assigned to alert all citizens of further fanatical news about emancipation. These crazy people were talking about emancipating their slaves, and they thought this was just outrageous. They're not going to be able to let that happen. So they had meetings regular political meetings out there, and they were sidestepping the royalty here in the eastern part. In 1850, we're just 10 years from Civil War now, the state legislature authorized an election to select delegates to a convention in Columbia for consideration of abolition issues. They were asked to assemble, consider the situation. That was the name of their assembly. Delegates to the convention from St. James Goose Creek were Wes Williams and Isaac Bradwell. These became protests. All of them began to focus on slavery, and in one resolution it said, defend slavery at all costs. The Wassamasaw slavery just 9 years before the Civil War began, they resolved to cooperate with all of the slaveholding states. Now, if somebody comes up to you and says, well, the Civil War wasn't about slaves, well, no, they're wrong. It was about slaves. I've gone through the minutes. I've read the minutes of these meetings, the meetings that kept minutes, and every single one of them talked about slavery. A few quotes from the Wasmosal Resolution. The unceasing and continued aggression of the abolitionists. The other slaveholding states were equally wronged. Our cooperative friends throughout the slaveholding states, the grave and important emergency. And then we have a railroad strike right here in Goose Creek, right outside the front door of this building. On that railroad that was built in 1855, when they were building it, they had a big strike. They were Irish workers. And they were treated so badly. They lived in barracks in Charleston. If you read the newspaper accounts of the strikes at the time, they make these Irish sound like they're animals. They say they're well fed and they're cared for. Why were they using Irish to build this railroad? They were cheaper than African slaves. No doubt about it. And they ended up arresting, I think, 32 Irishmen and put them in jail, but then they got out in about 6 or 8 months, and so that was that. But the lesson to be learned there is you could build a railroad with Irish labor cheaper than you could with black labor. And the black laborers were all up and down the railroad right here. They could have walked to work. There's the railroad strike. 3 days. Damnation to the Yankees, and we're going to get into the second half of the program here in a minute. Attention returned to the abolitionists when the convention was called in 1860 in Columbia for statewide delegates to consider the encroachment of the northern abolitionists and secession from the Union. This was the movement on the secession, and these are the guys from Goose Creek that attended. And they dissolved it. 169 conventioners met at St. Andrew's Society Hall, where the ordinance of secession was read to politely silent crowd. That was down in Charleston, on where Meeting Street and another street, that's on Meeting Street. And they were up in Columbia, but there was a rumor of smallpox spreading up there. So they left Columbia and they came to Charleston. They had a voice vote. It was unanimous. At noon, they had a voice vote to secede from the Union. And then they left and came back at 7 o'clock that evening, and it was unanimous. Every one of them then signed the document. Well, in that 7 hours from noon to that evening when they signed, the word spread by rail and by road and by Pony Express, spread throughout the state, so that here in right here in Goose Creek, they had the word by that evening. And they started making a flag that evening, right here in Goose Creek. And those are not the flags. And in the next flash, when we're going to get the next show up here in a minute, I'll show you the image of the flag that they made right here in Goose Creek. Damnation to the Yankees. Immediately the popular toast. Okay, white men in gray, black men in blue in Goose Creek. Secession. Slavery was the central theme. Don't let anybody tell you that it was about something other than slavery, because that's just not the case. If you want to know what the deal is, you get down to the brass tacks, you read the stuff that was being written at the time, not somebody else's opinion. But issues other than slavery were not mentioned. Just about every male in Goose Creek signed up and rushed to be a volunteer, from those that are barely 16 years old, you had to be 16, and all the way up to 48, they would take you. 50, you had no chance of serving. It was way too old. Back then, you died around then. So, Carlston William Vose, captain of the Goose Creek Company, that was his 18-mile house there. We learned about that a couple weeks ago. He was the leader of the Home Guard during the times of peace, and he wanted to volunteer to go into the Confederate Army, but they said he was too old, so he had to stay home. And remember, we mentioned that the 18-mile house was the cradle of the Deep South. This is where the crossroads were at that time. And there's a drawing. I don't know why there's 2 avenues again. I see this with plantations that are near each other. They'd have separate avenues instead of sharing one. But there is the 18-mile house tavern right there in the middle, and the road that went to Dorchester, the road that went into Crowfield, and then the 2 avenues. And see the big pond in the middle? That's where the Foxborough Pond is, and all of that. 18-mile house was the center of the community. John George Vose volunteered in the place of his father, And he was in college at Furman at the time. He was quite a progressive family for that era. And this is the setting. At the time that the Civil War began, you see the drawing of the tavern. It looks like it's two-story, doesn't it? And it looks like it has two chimneys. And then it has the outbuildings. And you see the Negro yard? That is Brandywine Apartments right there. Okay? And that's the 18 Mile House. John Vose wrote this in his diary. He wrote this. I'm just quoting his diary. I got home about 9 o'clock at night and found the whole family making a flag of the palmetto tree and the words Southern Republic sewed on under the tree. You see, the state had just seceded. That flag was hung across the road in front of Pa's store. I expect it was one of the first flags of the Confederate States. And I went around, because I'm a nerdy guy, and I looked and went under all kinds of places trying to find another place that had a flag that went up before this one. And I can't find anybody that put up a flag anywhere in this area, Charleston, Carolina, earlier than in the morning of December 21st. They signed off that night at 7, and then Mama started making the flag that night. The boy got home from college while his mama was making the flag, according to his diary. His sisters, he had two sisters, he had a dad there and his mama making the flag of the palmetto tree with Southern Republic on the bottom. A friend of mine did the drawing for me. All we had was his diary. And it was Christmas vacation time, see? So he was coming.
Did that depict the real flag?
Pardon me?
Did that picture depict the real flag?
No, that's a good question, Mike. No, it had a palmetto tree, and it had the word Southern Republic, and it was a blue flag. We think. He never did mention the color of the flag, okay? But there's no indication that it had a crescent on it. But you know, the crescent is no longer an element or a symbol that you could be proud of by this time. Back in the colonial period, a crescent meant you were royal. Along with the gorget, you were royal. Now the gorget is obsolete, and so is the crescent. You don't see anybody flashing that stuff, because the Declaration of Independence said we're free and equal. So you don't have, those are anachronistic symbols that you don't see anywhere else in Southern history that I've come across by the time we had the Revolution. Jane Vose made that first flag. I'm going back. And there's a map that was hand-drawn at that time when the Civil War began. It's just fascinating, and we don't have time to look at it, but you can see where the 18 Mile House Tavern is. Most white guys enlisted. There's some of their names. I would say most, just about, I'd say 99% of them. And the ones that didn't enlist are very interesting personalities. I hope we have time to talk about them. Peter Gaillard Stoney, owner of Medway Plantation, had 5 sons. All of them fought for the Confederacy. Photographs fed the magazines, had a lot of emotion. This was the first war here in this country where we had lots and lots of emotions. Remember, we had the Boston Massacre during the Revolutionary War, but it was a rare thing to have an image or a photo of anything. But we had a lot of this going on for the Civil War. And we had bigger-than-life heroes. Now, I'm going to say something to make you really mad. Really. My dad, and I believe him, my dad told me that Robert E. Lee was a traitor. Think about it. He took an oath. He was from West Point. He took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States of America, and then he was a traitor. Yes?
I got put in Facebook jail for saying that.
Did you? That's a dangerous thing to say. That's why I warned you ahead of time. So don't be saying that around me. But my daddy said that, and I didn't realize the implication until I got a little older. He was a traitor. This guy here, Bernard Elliott B., his family on the bee plantation, you know where Palmetto Parkway is in North Charleston now? That used to be part of our parish. And the bee plantation was there. And this guy was at fighting in Virginia, and the Battle of Bull Run, and he had a newspaper reporter follow him around that day. And one time he stopped and he told his men, he shouted at his men and said, "Look, hey, there's Jackson and his Virginians standing like a brick wall." I'm sorry, yes. What did he say again? Tell everybody. There's Jackson, standing like a, with his Virginians, standing like a stone wall. Thank you for correcting me. And his newspaper man, B, got shot and killed that day before the day ended. And so the newspaper wrote an article about B getting killed and what he said just before he died, and that became the moniker for the famous General Stonewall Jackson. Confederate General Ripley ordered the erection of harbor defenses in 1861. And William Bell got enough labor sent down from up here down into Charleston to build some defense lines. And he got his labor from Pine Grove House. Pine Grove and Spring Grove were the two plantations. They touched each other along the Cypress Garden Road. So they kind of give you an idea where that was. Here's William Bell's slaves at Pine Grove. I wrote down the names of all the slaves because you very, very, very seldom ever get the name of the slave. It's just like cattle or something, or horses, you know. But when this guy had the names, and so I wanted to show everybody these were actually real people. They had real names, they had real family, real moms and dads and the whole bit. And he had a whole bunch of them, didn't he?
February.
Uh-huh. Yeah, Dave, William, Belinda, Henny, Bitsy, Lucy, Parker.
There's Cuffy again.
Cussy? Well, you know, 100 years from now, they look back at the list of people in this room, they might bring a couple chuckles, you know. Spring Grove slaves, here's some more from Spring Grove. The other ones were Pine Grove. And they rode the train from Mount Holly down to Charleston and built defensive bulwarks. They went down there on 30-day cycles. I know I'm going fast, but you're not going to have a test or anything. They had problems. They didn't have enough to eat. They began to suffer the effects of the war, destruction. The old church was a refuge during the war. Reverend Phillips was the minister of St. Stephen's Church on Anson Street in Charleston, but it was so bombed out that the people began to get on the train on Sunday and come up to the St. James Goose Creek Church here and have services here. And then this guy, Reverend L. Phillips, began to walk from the church down Howell Hall Road all the way to where Mount Zion Church is today. I wish I could tell you more about it. I believe, and I can prove it, that Mount Zion was the first African-American church in South Carolina. I just haven't put it all together yet, but they need a historic marker there. I want to tell you, but I don't have time tonight, why I believe it's the truth. But he ended up baptizing 23 new Christians. Yes, sir?
Is that the church at Howell Hall and Back River Road?
Yes. Yep. And I'm so tempted to get into that. It's a fascinating story. Maybe if you have a minute. But anyway, he baptized 23 of them, and when the war got over, they even hired their own minister and everything. This is what the church looked like downtown. The people suffered severe shortages of everything. The Yankees dropped what they had, the stone fleet. They'd have ships full of rocks and sink them in the harbor so you couldn't get in and out of Charleston. I'll let you just read that. There's a mom with a little white baby. I tell you what, corn, $3. That's expensive today. Bacon, $1 a pound. The ration, when they were retreating out of there, was, well, I think we'll get into that later. It was like 7 ounces of corn and 4 ounces of bacon a day, something like that. Don't plant cotton or tobacco. The newspaper said plant food. We're starving to death. Don't plant cotton. Don't plant tobacco. One telegram said, we have now on the Northeastern Railroad 1 engine and 15 cars employed in carrying wood to the city of Charleston, as our machines and car power are now needed on our Macon Road. That is the road in Georgia. They're having to defend it from the invading Yankees. But they were cold down. It gets cold in the wintertime, and they didn't have any wood in Charleston to stay warm. Rail service was suspended through Goose Creek in 1863. Food became so scarce that more than 90 Goose Creek families, or 26% of the total, relied upon relief. We had an organization in town that went around and gave food to starving families. And what do you say? 26% of the total relied upon that relief. The prevailing social order began to break down in South Carolina. I use that broken image because it's just so telling. The black families are starting, some of them are packing up with their families and moving towards the northern line to the best of their ability. Most of the African slaves stayed right on the plantation. I'd say 99% of them just stayed right there. But they had lots of publications going out to African American slaves. Seek Freedom. Here's Christian Fleetwood, Medal of Honor recipient. He seized the colors after 2 color bearers had been shot down and bore them nobly through the flight. So they were advertised. William Tecumseh Sherman never came to Goose Creek, but he was blamed for a lot of things. And that because he had a powerful, dynamic name. He's blamed for hanging a black lady in Bloomfield. Anybody all live in Bloomfield in Crowfield? Yeah, he's blamed for hanging a woman there off one of those old trees that are falling down. And he was never in South Carolina he was never in Goose Creek. No battles in Goose Creek. Yeah, he went through Atlanta. He was bitter. William Bell returned from combat after 60 days parole. In 1864, he rode out with the Charleston Light Dragoons, but was wounded and released on parole from Savannah, where the war shifted in expectation of Union General William T. Sherman's push to the sea. After a few glorious days with his family, he rode the train to Florence, transferred to Columbia, and reported to General M.C. Butler. Butler told him to go home, get your family, and get out of there, because they were retreating out of Charleston. And he said, we're going to need you somewhere else. So it was near Christmas, and the Union Army was approaching the Savannah River when Bell arrived at Pine Grove to pack his wife, children, and white nurse and hurry them to the station, where they departed on one of the last northeastern rail cars bound north from the station. That was this railroad track right here by the firehouse, was the Northeastern Company. And now they're complaining, the railroad company is complaining because they're doing all this work for the Southern government, but they're not getting paid for it. And they say they can't stay in business and keep running our train if we're not going to get our pay. The men remaining in the Goose Creek countryside drilled as the South Carolina 18th Regiment Militia, but the militia seldom consisted of more than 45 to 50 males between the ages of 17 and 60, and it was not a formidable force. This guy here, Philip Porcher, was too old to serve in the Confederacy. This is a picture of him when he was a captain in the Confederate forces. Well, no, it was in the Union forces at the time. Here's another traitor for you. But he was the overseer. He was in charge of Berkeley County, keeping order in Berkeley County. All the law enforcement, everything had withdrawn. There was a martial vacuum here. He was in charge of keeping peace, and he had about 45 to 50 men to do that. And here they are. These are the only men and information I could find about his people. You can see that Captain Philip Porcher, he lived in Otranto. He had one 16, 17-year-old kid, and he had one that was 50 years old or older, were 22 of them. Then he had Captain Wiggins, Captain William Cummings, and Captain I.A. Varn. They were in the northern part of the parish. What a job that was, huh? Now, how many of y'all know that E.C. Dennis built a fort, a Confederate fort? Well, I'll be darned. This is Highway 176, just before you get to the bridge that goes to Orangeburg County. On 176, going northwest, just before you get to the bridge, leaving Berkeley County into Orangeburg County, you look over and you see a big cornfield, and there's a clump of trees in the cornfield. That's where the Confederate fort was. E.C. Dennis built that fort using those men, the Varn's men, the men that lived in that area that were under Porcher's command. They built that fort, and there was another gun replacement down here on the lower left hand of the image. He had a gun emplacement there, and he had a gun emplacement there in that field. And the people that own that land graciously do not cut down those trees, and they just farm around it. Johnny, did you know about the Confederate fort here in Berkeley County? It's one of those well-kept secrets. We'll take a ride around here one day. I don't think it's a bluff. No, it's not a bluff. Do you see where it is? There's a circle there? That's a cornfield, and the cornfield is not on a bluff. The road is, let me come over here. I'm trying to make sure I stay out of the way.
That's State Road, correct?
Yes, that's 176 State Road.
This will be coming back to Goose Creek on this side.
Yeah, here's 176. From Goose Creek, going following 176, you call it State Road, and State Road goes all the way to Orangeburg, and Orangeburg is about, the boundary of Orangeburg County is about 1 mile there. And here is that fort. You have a big clump of trees, not a big clump, maybe about the size of this building. And then down here we had another emplacement for a gun. He never used it because the Yankees were so overpowering, it would have been suicide. So they built it, they waited, but as the Yankees built up their forces here and started moving that way, they went ahead and retreated.
Was that EC or EJ?
I don't know.
It's at EC.
I know it said EC, but he was so confident when he said that, I thought he might be, I don't know. When the sheriff looks at you and says, you know, you kind of go along with it. Really? Really?
I just say that because EJ was the general in the Confederate Army from Macbeth.
Thank you. He came home on leave, medical leave, but he was not a general. But he came home and got a vigilante crew together. I can't get into everything. I wish I could. He got a vigilante group together, and he went from place to place to make sure that the slaves were not rebelling. There was a rebellion in Pineville that made it feel essential. He had to get a group of vigilantes together to go from one plantation to the next. You might be right. He might have been a general, but I don't think so. Might have been his son. Yes, Johnny?
Where the trees are, is there a berm or a hollow or any kind of structural material there?
I haven't done any archaeological, or what do you call it when you dig around, archaeological work? I haven't done any. I don't know, and I did talk to the owner of the property probably 25, 30 years ago. I'm sure he'd let us go in there and look. Might let him do that too. If you want me to get in touch with him, I can do it. Call up the Home Guard. The Charleston Mercury reported an order to all slave owners in selected parishes, including Goose Creek, to deliver 20% of their slaves with spades or shovels and 3 days' ration to rail depots for transport to Charleston, where they would labor for 30 days. Servants reported to the front lines. Kent went with Harry Porcher, and Alex went with John Vose. Now, I don't know if I have it in this program, but I remember Kent, the mom, and Otranto told Kent, when the boy came home, he finally turned 16, he came in hollering and screaming and said, I'm going to join the Confederacy, I'm 16 now, and I just signed up, and everybody was scared to death because this guy, Harry Porcher, had signed up to join the Confederacy, and they said, no, don't go there. And the mom said to her son, you go with him, Alex, and don't let anything happen to him. And if anything happens to him, then don't you bother coming back. That was a pretty bit, that's pretty. Now, how do I know that? The 16-year-old daughter wrote a letter to her cousin in Camden telling you what I just told you. Do you believe a 16-year-old? I think so. I think I do. I think they did. So, and then the other guy, Alec, well, let's see. Yeah, John Vose. Kent went with Harry Porcher. And then John Vose, he said that the slave that he grew up with, his friend, he said they were children together, they grew up together, they always stuck together, they went to war together, and when he was freed, he stayed with them. And then one day he just walked off. That's what he said. One day he just walked off. General Beauregard ordered retreat of the Confederates. They evacuated Charleston. And they went right on down the state road, right past Otranto, right over the Goose Creek Bridge, right up 176 where I just showed you, past the old Confederate fort, into Orangeburg and on and on. John George Vose traveled on one of the last Eastern Railroad trains through Goose Creek. When he got to the Mount Holly station, he said he just couldn't stand it. He jumped off the train and walked all the way back to his dad's tavern and home there at the 18 Mile House Tavern. And he said he had a, here it is, well, maybe it's back here. He said he hadn't eaten that good in months, and he didn't eat that good again for many months. But he spent the night there with his family, his mom and dad and his sisters, and had good food. And the next day he caught the train again, went back to Mount Holly, and waited for the next train to go up to Virginia to join the ranks. And there's a whole story of him coming back with his slave, the guy that was with him. They came back. And how many of y'all in here are Masons? Masons? Yeah, the Masons helped him get back from one Mason house to the next, all the way back to the south. We'll talk about that, Mike, at breakfast. You see, I spent, oh, here is Marianne Porcher. She's the 16-year-old daughter. They said that these Confederates, I'm trying to find out, she marveled at their impoverished gallantry and declared that while they survived on miserable rations and slept by the glow of the numerous campfires at Otranto, as they retreated, each of 10 cold and wet nights, not one thing did we miss after them. So the Confederates retreating through here didn't bother, they didn't steal the chickens and do whatever. They didn't bother anybody, according to her. But they spent the night and then moved on the next day. When Sherman's soldiers marched from Savannah, Georgia to Columbia, South Carolina, the blue Union juggernaut skirted northwest of the St. James Goose Creek Parish, bearing directly upon the capital city in the center of the state, leaving Goose Creek and the rest of the eastern flank to Union General John Porter Hatch. Porter Hatch made his office, his command office, at the Otranto House. The retreating forces burned the Goose Creek Bridge. Oh, and that was pretty cool. I remember they were the only white residents remaining on the western side of the bridge, and they felt isolated, and the girl wrote they were at the tender mercy of the wicked world, of the tender mercy of the wicked. 220 feet long. I didn't know earlier what that was. And this comes from this very detailed description. John Poppenheim was the only official. He was the highway commissioner, and he was the only official in the Home Guard. Everybody else were just parts of the militia. And he was responsible for representing them when the Yankees came through. He met Porcher at the 18 Mile House, where Poppenheim surrendered Goose Creek, his section of Goose Creek, which was all of Berkeley County at the time, to General E.E. Potter at the 18 Mile House. Okay, I think I'm going to, this is time now. We've been here an hour and a half. I know you guys are just loving it. I'm going to go ahead and pick up here next week because I want you to hear and see how the Yankees went from house to house and how they talked to the women of the house and how they freed their slaves. It's remarkable. I mean, it stuns me how they were able to do that without a whole lot of chaos and murder, but they were able to pull it off. And you all were very patient with me tonight. I appreciate it. We've been here an hour and a half, going at it for an hour and a half, and we're going to pick up right here next time, okay, next week. Okay? Thank you very much.